Hello guys, in this lesson we want to add loading to the project. So after finishing this video, if you refresh the page, you'll see a loading like this, and after that the data will be loaded successfully. Follow this lesson if you like to add it to your project. Here the first thing that we want to do is creating the useLoading for handling the state of the loading in one place. So in all components, if we want to show loading, hide loading, or use the current state of the loading, we can use this hook. So let's go and create it. In the front end, src, hooks, right click and create a new file with the name of useLoading.js. Here first of all, we want to import everything from the React for creating this hook. Okay, use a state for creating the loading state, create context, and use context for creating and using the context. First of all, let's create the context. Its name is loading context and we create it by using the create context function from the React. Now I want to create its provider. I want to call it LoadingProvider. Okay, export const LoadingProvider. We get the children prop, so we can use this loading context provider as its parent. At the first line, I want to create isLoading state using the useState. Okay, const isLoading, set isLoading from the useState with the default value of true. So by default, it shows the loading until we set it to false. Other than isLoading, I want to expose two functions to the outside from this hook, showLoading and hideLoading. Okay, showLoading. Set the isLoading to true, so the isLoading will be true, and hideLoading set it to false. As you can see, it's very simple. Now we just want to put the isLoading, showLoading, and hideLoading inside the loading context provider's value and return it from here. We have the loading context provider here. We set its value to isLoading, showLoading, and hideLoading. So inside the components, we can use this state and these functions. And we put the children here inside it. So the loading context provider will be its parent. Now we just want to use this use context for using this loading context inside the components. Okay, our loading context, loading provider, and useLoading are ready. Now let's see where we are. We successfully created our useLoading hook. Now we just need to add the loading provider to the index.js. Let's do it. Let's open the Explorer, go to the index.js. Here after the browser router, write loading provider, cut the ending part and put it before the browser router. Here we go. So our application is wrapped by the loading provider. Okay, we just added the loading provider to the index.js. Now we need to create the loading component for using the state of the useLoading for showing or not showing the loading. Let's create the component. Close this index.js and useLoading, and here inside the components right click and create a new folder with the name of loading. Right click on it again and create a new file with the name of loading.js, and right click on it again and create the CSS file with the name of loading.module.css. Close the Explorer, open the loading.js. Here write RFC for creating the loading component. Now let's add it to the App.js for showing it. So open the App.js and here at the top of the header, write loading. Okay, now if we go to the browser, at the top, we'll see the loading. So now we can work on it. Go to the loading.js. Here, first of all, we want to add the imports, useLoading from the useLoading hooks that we created, and classes from this loading module CSS that we add here. At the first line of this component, I want to get the state of isLoading from the useLoading hook. Then I want to check if the isLoading is false, just return. Okay, here we check if the isLoading is false, just return. Don't return this, so it will not render anything. But if it's true, it's gonna show this part. Here, first of all, let's remove this loading text and give the class name of container to our parent div. Then add another div and give it the class name of items. Inside the items, I just want to show an image with the src of loading SVG. We don't have this loading SVG in the project, so we need to open up the Explorer, open up the public folder, then copy our loading.svg image inside it. If you like, you can put another image with another extension, for example, maybe GIF. This is what I chose. Let's close the loading SVG. So our image is ready. Close the Explorer. And at its bottom, I want to add an H1 with the text of loading. Now if we go to the browser and refresh the page, we will see our image and our text. But it's not showing well because we want it to cover the whole page and be placed on the center of the page. So we need to work on its CSS. Let's go to the code, open the loading module CSS and start coding. For its container, I want to use these styles. Position of fixed, so by scrolling, it's not go up or down. Width and height of 100%, background of white with the alpha of EA, Z index of 10,000 or just a big number so you can make sure that it is on top of everything, and top and left of 0. So it starts from top left, and by width and height of 100%, it covers the whole page. Now that we have our container, we just need to put our items on the middle. Let's do it. Display of flex direction of column because we want to show them from top to bottom, not from left to right. At the top the image, at the bottom the loading text. Justify content, align items of center so it will be both vertically and horizontally on the middle. Height of 80% and width of 100%. If we look at the browser, we'll see the loading beautifully placed on the middle of the screen. But I like to give this image a border bottom so it's like this ball is hitting a flat surface. Let's go to the code and write this. Okay, let's see it. It's beautiful. I also like to change the color of the loading to the brown like this one. Let's do it. Okay, I think this is beautiful. Now let's see where we are. We successfully created the loading component. We just added to the App.js, added the image and its CSS. Now we are on the last step, that is creating the loading interceptor and adding it to the App.js. If you ask what is an interceptor listens to your request that's going to the server and the response that's coming from the server. Axios has a functionality for adding interceptor into it. So let's add it. Go to the code, open the Explorer, right click on the src and create a new folder with the name of Interceptors. Then right click on it and create a new file with the name of loading interceptor.js, like this. Close the Explorer and start writing. First of all, we want to import Axios. Now I want to create a function with the name of setLoadingInterceptor that gets show loading and hide loading from the outside. The reason that I'm getting these two functions because I defined them inside the useLoading hook. So I need to pass them from a component to work here. And I want to do it from the App.js. Now let's set up the interceptor for the request that goes to the server. Okay, for setting up an interceptor for the request that goes to the server, just need to write axios.interceptors.request.use. For the unresolved part of the promise, we just show the loading. It means the request going to the server successfully. But when there is an error inside the request going to the server, we hide the loading because in case of error, we don't want to show the loading on the screen and stuck into a white screen. So we hide the loading and we return a promise that reject. That is a shorthand for creating a new promise and calling its reject with the error. Now let's add another interceptor for the responses coming from the server. Okay, this one is a little bit different because in both cases, unresolved and on error, we are going to hide the loading because that makes sense. When the response came from the server is okay, just hide the loading and return it. And if there is an error from the server, we hide the loading again and we return promise.reject with the error. Pretty simple. So only the happy requests going to the server are going to show the loading and all the other cases are going to hide the loading. Now let's just export this setLoadingInterceptor as default. So you can import this module both by default export and named export. You can just use this named export, doesn't matter. Now let's use this set loading interceptor inside the App.js. So go to the App.js. Here first of all I want to add the useLoading from the useLoading hook and set loading interceptor from the loading interceptor. Okay, because the functions that I want to pass to the set loading interceptor, show loading and hide loading, are inside the useLoading hook. So at the first line, let's get these functions. Okay, const show loading and hide loading that are coming from the useLoading hook. Now I want to import the use effect from the React, because I want to use it for calling the set loading interceptor and pass these two functions into it. So here press enter, and inside the use effect, we call the set loading interceptor and we'll pass show loading and hide loading. So we are going to handle the loading inside the loading interceptor by the functions that we are getting from the useLoading. Now, if we go to the code, as you can see, we have no loading anymore because loading interceptor works really well. Since the page is loaded, we're not seeing any loading. But for seeing the loading, you can press F12. Let's zoom a little bit. Here on the Network tab, you will see this no throttling. You can set it on, for example, fast 3G and refresh the page to emulate a slow connection. So you will see the loading, and after that, you'll see that the data is loaded. Now, if you go to the food page, we'll see the loading again, and it works perfectly. Okay, this was for this lesson. You've been watching Code with Nasir, and I hope to see you next time.